All right, I guess we'll get started. Thanks everybody for joining us. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm marketing operations here at Smarty. Today's webinar is going to be about how to analyze Smarty's API output. We're very excited to get started. However, before we move forward and I introduce our presenters, let's go over some housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded. We will send a copy of it out to everybody who registered. You'll be able to find that in your email inbox. And yes, you can share that with whoever you think would find value in this content. Second, to interact with our presenters and other audience members, feel free to use the chat and the Q&A features inside the Zoom webinar interface. We will be monitoring that, and I will bring that information up to our presenters for them to address your questions. Speaking of our presenters, today we have Lyle Derland, head of our support team, and Jeffrey Duncan, one of our tech geniuses and all-around address gurus. And we're really excited to hear what they have to share. So without further ado, Lyle.
Thank you. Let's jump in. Beautiful splash page. Let's jump into my first slide. Today, we're really answering the question of when you're looking at all the output from our API, and there's a lot of output fields, both the US street address API and the international street address API, how am I going to know if the address is real? That's essentially the question we're looking at today. And for the US street address API, there's really two fields that you want to look at, the DPV match code and the enhanced match field. Before we jump into examples, the DPV match code, DPV stands for delivery point validation. It's essentially a US Postal Service field. It references US Postal Service data only. Enhanced match refers to a process we now use that encompasses more than just USPS data. We have 20 million non-USPS addresses as well as the USPS ones. So let's just look at the DPV match code and the enhanced match fields for this first example. Notice here on the top, I've got an input address, very simple. And on the input version on the left, and then on the right, I've got the standardized version. This is the USPS format for this particular address. Down below is a portion of the raw US Street API output, the analysis portion. And I've highlighted, of course, the two fields we're looking at, DPV match code and enhanced match. In this case, we see a DPV match code of Y, essentially means yes, the address is in the US Postal Service data. There are, of course, other fields in the analysis section, but in terms of if the address is real or not, that's the main one you need to look at. You may be interested a little further down, you'll see DPV vacant. That may also be of concern because an address can be real, but no one lives there. And so the USPS may tell you, may not try to attempt delivery if they have it marked as vacant. So that's one that you might want to check as well. Anyway, let's, in my next slide here, I'm going to go over all the DPV match code values. You know, what can you possibly see in the DPV match code field? The Y, if you see a Y, essentially means, again, remember, DPV match code is specifically US Postal Service related. So the Y means the address is present in the USPS data. And S really stands for secondary. Secondary is a way of saying apartment or suite information. A DPV match code of S means that the base address is good, but the apartment number that was submitted is not recognized. A DPV match code of D, excuse me, indicates the address is missing an apartment number or suite number. And the DPV match code of N, the address is not present in the USPS data. And null, as in if the DPV match code doesn't show up at all, that also indicates the address is not present in the USPS data. Important thing to note is that when you get a DPV match code of N, it doesn't necessarily mean the address isn't real. It means specifically it's not in the USPS data. And that's why the enhanced match field exists. Let's go to that one. So in the enhanced match field, these are the possible values you could see. Postal match, when we use the word postal to basically be synonymous with USPS. So postal match means the address is present in USPS data. Sorry, anything to add so far, Jeffrey? So far, I got Jeffrey with me, of course, and he may chime in at any time. Postal match, the address is present in the USPS data. Non-postal match, address is present in non-USPS data. Unknown secondary, fairly explanatory as long as you know what the word secondary, when we use secondary parts of an address, we're talking about like apartments and suites. So unknown secondary, there's an apartment number or suite number that's not recognized that was submitted. Missing secondary address is missing an apartment number. Ignored input. That simply means that some data that was submitted was ignored when we found the match. Nothing too rocket sciencey about it. And then enhanced match of none indicates that no match was found using our enhanced matching. So we've now covered what the possible answers are for those two fields, the DPV match code and enhanced match values. Let's jump into a bunch of address examples and see these in action. So this is similar to the one I showed you initially. In this case, I've contrived an apartment number that doesn't exist. So 1 King Street apartment 999. You'll notice that the DPV match code is S, which essentially means bad secondary. The apartment number is not recognized. It's unknown to the U.S. Postal Service. In the enhanced match field, you wouldn't necessarily need to consult. Once you get that DPV match code of S, you're pretty much done in terms of it, knowing what you need to know about the address. If you wanted to consult enhanced match, you just see that it confirms what we already know. Unknown, postal match, unknown secondary, ignored input. Okay.
Lyle, real quick.
Yeah.
There across the top, just to clarify for those who might not know. So the top left address is what you entered.
Yeah, that's like what we're thinking of that as what the customer input into the API. Yeah.
And then the left is what it's delivered out as far as
the right, the arrow points to the output version.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of the address.
So that's the standardized
version of the same address.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So that I pretty much had finished talking about this slide, DPV match code of S here. So far we've seen a DPV match code of Y and a DPV match code of S. Based on those, you really know what you need to know without even consulting the enhanced match field yet. Let's look at the next example. Sorry, jump in if you want, Jeffrey. So far, so good. Here's the DPV match code of D. Notice this is the same address that we looked at a second ago, but I've just removed the apartment number. So I'm just submitting 1 King Street without an apartment number. And the DPV match code is D, which means missing an apartment number. Again, based on the DPV match code, we know what we need to know. The base address is good, but it's missing apartment number. The enhanced match field only confirms, it's a postal match, meaning USPS match, and it's missing a secondary apartment number.
Lyle, is it still a good address if it doesn't have a secondary?
Well, we know that the base address is good. When you get a DPV match code of D, it's only a problem with the secondary portion, right? So 1 King Street is real. It's just that the U.S. Postal Service data has subunits for that address. So we suspect that you are missing an apartment number. We'd recommend in this case that if you can go back to your original, the person who submitted the address, go back and just double check with them. Are you missing an apartment number? Would you like to add that? Okay, so if I ship a package to 1 King Street, knowing that it doesn't have a secondary because I don't have one, would it still get delivered? That's a question for the USPS. I don't know if you have a solid answer on that one, but really that's up to the U.S. Postal Service. I think it's going to come down to the local mail carrier. If the local mail carrier decides maybe with this address, there may be some kind of a main office that they deliver it to, and the main office knows how to deliver it to the secondaries, the subunits.
Like the first floor or the main area of the apartment building.
Exactly. Okay. So whether it actually gets delivered without the apartment number, that we can't guarantee one way or the other. Cool. Right. And it's going to be ultimately up to what kind of the knowledge of the mail carrier and what they do with it. So,
another question has come up. How much is the API able to standardize addresses which don't have DPV or enhanced matches? That is, do we get the address in a standardized format even if it doesn't exist?
For the most part, yes. I think especially if you submit an address in components, we can't always do this if you submit freeform, actually. Correct me if I'm
correct.
Misstepping, but if you submit an address in components, if you submit a street address in its own field and a city, state, and zip in their own fields, we will standardize the address even if we don't find a match at all, right?
Sure.
So standardizing means standardizing capitalization. The street suffix like street is going to get that standard abbreviation. Yeah. Same with directionals will be standardized. Stuff, the standard abbreviations for those things.
They won't be matched, but they will be normalized or standardized.
Yeah. In that case, the DPV, you would see like a DPV match code of N, we still standardize it for you, even though we did find a match.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Speaking of DPV match code of N, let's move to this next one. Before I do, so notice I put in 1 King Street. That's the address we've been looking at. For this next one, I contrived a house number. I've made up this 111 King Street. Doesn't actually exist. Of course, King Street does, but there's no 111. So now the DPV match code is shown as N, meaning, excuse me, remember this is specific to USPS. So the N here means this is not in the USPS data, right? Address is still standardized, as you see. The enhanced match, one of the important things to point out here is when you get the DPV match code of N, that is when it's important to check the enhanced match field, because there may be more. If you get a DPV match code of Y, you're pretty much done. You know it's a real address. The USPS has it in their records. It's deliverable by almost any carrier. When you get the DPV match code of N, it might be a bad address, or it might just not be in the USPS data. So that's when you will want to refer to the enhanced match field. In this particular case, you see enhanced match none. This is not a good address. Not deliverable, doesn't exist. There is no 111 King Street. Okay, so far so good.
Yep. Good.
Okay. In this case, we actually see the DPV match code of N. In this next example, the DPV match code field is absent. Notice the house number here. I just went extremely long with it, 11111 King Street. It's outside of any of the actual range of King Street. And in this case, the DPV match code doesn't even show up. And so the absence of the DPV match code in and of itself is just like DPV match code of N, no match. You will also usually see a DPV footnote of A1, which means the same thing, invalid address, as far as the USPS is concerned.
So on your previous slide where you showed all of the definitions, there was N and null. So
null essentially means no output field. The output field doesn't show up at all.
Okay, so this is not the same.
It does not say NULL. It is an empty response.
Yeah. So this slide here is showing what I'm referring to when DPV match code of null mean it's just not present.
Okay.
The field itself is just not there. It's synonymous with the DPV match code of N.
Good question, Andrew.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
good question. Good. So far we've seen a couple of examples of the address is not valid, and enhanced match just echoes that. Enhanced match none. In this next slide, this is a brand new address we're looking at here, and we're going to see for this address the DPV match code is N, but this happens to be an address that is real, just not in the U.S. Postal Service data. That's why you are going to want to check the enhanced match field, and in which case we see non-postal match, non-USPS match, meaning this is a real address. And this is good. Notice it's standardized. It's deliverable by people other than USPS. So it's a real address, but not in the USPS data. In the next slide, notice in this one, I put in a unit B, which I know exists. In the next slide, we're going to look at the exact same address, except now notice I've switched to unit C, which I happen to know does not exist. And so the DPV match code is the same, and meaning USPS does not know about this address. But enhanced match now says, not only does it say non-postal match, meaning non-USPS match, but unknown secondary. So the unit C part is not in our data, right? It's possible that it's real, but for sure it's not in our data. And we definitely would recommend double checking with whoever submitted the address if you can. It's like we're not recognizing that unit C. You want to double check that. So far so good.
Yep, perfect.
Okay. Let's see. On the next one, same address, but I stripped the unit entirely. We see the DPV match code of N, and we see enhanced match, non-postal match, missing secondary. Right. So this is a non-USPS address, and it's missing a secondary. In other words, we're expecting to see a secondary, and we don't. So again, this is an opportunity. If you have the opportunity to reach back out to whoever submitted the address and say, "Hey, we think this is missing an apartment or suite number." You want to double check that.
Yeah, it means that we know about addresses at that location that have secondary numbers or apartments or units. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, I believe that sums up that's the end of the last of our examples from the U.S. side. Any other questions? We kind of caught up on questions, Andrew.
Yes, there was one question about completely changing an address. For example, the address that Smarty returns is a completely different street. What causes this to happen? So 261 Center Road gets changed to 261 North Cotter Road.
Yeah,
So that's the first part of the question. The second is there an easy way in the Smarty output to identify the cases where that has happened?
yes. That it's not technically part of what we had prepared for this, but Jeff and I are both familiar with this. So that is going to be a lax link address. Let me explain. If you see a change like that, it almost always means it's a lax link address. What's a lax link address? So at the time that the 911 emergency system was implemented, addresses were sometimes reformatted to better represent to whoever, to emergency services, how to get there, how to arrive there, how to physically represent the address. So a lot of times rural routes were renamed. In some cases, a house on a corner that was referencing the one street changed to the other street, for example. And sometimes you'll even see renumbering. Houses get renumbered, right? So there were some changes that took place to a bunch of addresses at the time of the emergency system implementation. And so the USPS has this big data set called LaxLink. And what you'll see in those cases, whenever you see that, look for a footnote of, I think it's going to be LI for LaxLink, and that will indicate to you, this is a LaxLink address. By the way, both the input address and the one it got changed to should be deliverable by USPS. They know both versions of the address. We just happen to be giving you the newer version. Does that make sense in our output? Hopefully that clears that up.
Great.
Anything
Thanks.
to add, Jeffrey? Oh, good. Okay. Jumping into our next slide here. International Street Address API. Again, the essential question we're answering is, how do I know if the address is real? In the case of the International Street Address API, there are two fields to look at. They're named differently than from the US Street Address API. The two fields you want to look at are verification status, especially, and then also the address precision. Those are the two output fields that you're going to check if the address is real. We'll see those in this first address example, a really simple example in Victoria, Canada, 123 Cook Street. And you're looking at the analysis for this particular address. And you see highlighted the two fields we're talking about. Verification status is verified, address precision in this case is delivery point. So let's go over now specifically, what could you possibly see? What are all the possibilities for verification status? And what are all the possibilities for address precision? So here's the list for verification status. Fairly straightforward. Verified. If you see a verification status of verified, the address was completely verified. We are recommending delivery to this address. We, feel pretty confident it is a real address and deliverable. If you see partial, only parts of the address were verified, and usually we would not recommend trusting this address or considering it deliverable. Ambiguous doesn't mean the address is bad. It just means we got more than one response for that particular address. And you'll want to, in that case, you'll want to check the address precision of each of the address candidates. See more about that in a moment. And then a verification status of none of the address was verified. So verification status is fairly straightforward. The happy answer is verified. That's what you want to see. If you want to trust an address, you want to see a verification status verified. Okay, on this next slide, in that address precision field, these are the possibilities. Delivery point, which basically means building, sub-building, or mailbox. A delivery point is essentially what it sounds like. Premise, we define as building or street segment. And if an address precision is delivery point or premise, you're going to see that the verification status is verified. Anything less than that, you're going to see partial. So address precision of thoroughfare, which basically means street. If the address precision is only street, we're essentially saying to you, the street is valid, but the house itself, no, right? We're not able to confirm in the data that we have that the house number is good, but the street is, right? And locality just means city, administrative area, state, region, or province. So in the case of Canada, province. I think in Mexico, for example, they use states like the US does. In many countries, they're just called regions, right? So that big geographical subdivision is called an administrative area in our API. So those are the possible values in the address precision output field. let's jump into unless there are other questions,
I'm good.
comments. Okay, let's jump into
There's
there's one. So,
one additional question here
Sure.
that isn't necessarily about what you just showed, but how long does it take from when a new building, like for example, in Utah, we're building new homes every day.
yeah.
How long does that take to show up in Smarty's tools?
Well, there's two parts of that answer. And let's start by talking about the US side of things, even though we had jumped into international. But on the US side, we're relying on the US Postal Service. So there's the waiting period of when the US Postal Service gets the address into their data. Maybe that's because the mail carrier noticed, hey, there's a new subdivision, or some USPS employee noticed, hey, there's a new subdivision. We need to pay attention to these. But it sometimes takes months. Unfortunately, it takes a while, and so we'll see unhappy end users who they've moved into a brand new house and it's not in the USPS data yet, and it's not in our data yet, because in those cases we're relying on the USPS data. So there's the first step of it getting into the USPS data, and then once it's in the USPS data, once a month they package all their data in a form that's consumable by us, and we download that. And so we're not only waiting for them to get it in their data, but then waiting for them to get it to us.
Sure.
And for us to package that and get it ready. So the short answer is months, unfortunately. A number of
up to months.
A number. I mean, the very fastest that would happen, I would say 2 months at the shortest.
Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, depending on how long it takes to get into the USPS data, I don't know, it could be a lot longer.
And some of that depends on the contractor or the company that's building the address. Many times they will submit those addresses to the Postal Service even before they've started construction. As soon as they have a lot, they begin, or they submit that to the U.S. Postal Service. And that makes its way to us. So we could even have the address before construction has begun, if the contractor is doing that right. The contractor waits until someone moves in and then they submit it. Well, that's when it takes a long time.
Sure. Okay, another question here. We have the Smarty APIs integrated into a public safety application. Often our customers are concerned more with the physical location of the address than whether or not the address is deliverable. So we can get a lot of questions about, so we do get a lot of questions about non-postal addresses. Will we have time to talk about that today?
Well, I mean, we essentially have. If you want to know if the address is real, you're going to want to check the two fields. The DPV match code says, is it real to the USPS? It doesn't answer the question, does it exist? So you could have a non-USPS that'll show you a DPV match code of N. But if you have any of our newer US address verification plans, you also have access to the enhanced match output field. And that's going to tell you we don't have 100% of addresses in the US, but the vast majority, even if they're non-USPS, right? So as long as you check the enhanced match, that's going to tell you if it's real.
One more field that you can look at in addition to that is the geocode. If we provide a rooftop geocode, it's because there's a structure there at that address.
Okay. So in order to view that rooftop geocode, you'd have to have a rooftop geocoding license. Otherwise, you're going to get, is it ZIP4 geocoding?
ZIP9.
ZIP plus 4 or ZIP9.
ZIP plus 4.
Yeah. And for anyone who's watching who doesn't have a rooftop geocoding license, if you log out of your account and go to our homepage, you can test that on a few addresses. You can see the rooftop response.
Excellent. Thank you.
Welcome. So jumping back into our international address example here, 129 Cook Street in Victoria, Canada. Again, on the left side, you see what it might have looked like when it was input by a customer or an end user. And on the right, the top right, you see our standardized version of it, complete with, the standardized, the administrative area, BC, and then the postal code. And then, of course, most importantly, in the analysis section, a verification status of verified. In this case, the address precision is not delivery point, which is the very best, but this is address precision to premise. Again, with an address precision to premise, we do recommend treating it as a valid address. Let's jump into the next one. Here, I've taken the same address and just made up a house number, similar to what I did on the US examples. There is no 999 Cook Street, so I wanted to test, what does the API say about that? If I happen to put in an address that doesn't exist on Cook Street, and we see the verification status turns to partial, and the address precision is only thoroughfare, which means street. So we're telling you only parts of the address were verified. In this case, we can verify Cook Street. And that's all we can verify. We're not able to verify the 999 part of it, the house number, the primary number. Right. Next example. Here I contrived a street name. I made up a street name to see what the API would do with it. So we have 999 Nonsense Street. Again, the verification status is only partial. Only parts of the address are verified. And the address precision that we're able to verify is locality, which means city. We're telling you in this case, Victoria, the city, is valid. Is validated, is verified. But the whole street address is not in our data.
Nonsense.
So there's that one. Let's see. What's my next slide? Okay, in the next slide, I'm going to illustrate what a verification status of ambiguous looks like. Got a new address in Great Britain, 22 Fox in London. So with that input, there happened to be, our API is going to give you two address matches. There's a 22 Fox Hill in London, and in a separate location, there's a 22 Fox Lane.
Notice the input didn't have a street suffix on it or a street type.
Yeah, we just input with 22 Fox. And so we found both, and we don't know which one you meant. So we give them both to you. They're both really solid matches, but we don't know which one you meant. We give them both to you. You'll see a verification status of ambiguous. Remember, ambiguous doesn't mean bad. It just means more than one. Okay, so for each one, you're going to see this output. You'll see this raw API output separately for each of the candidates. In this case, we're looking at 22 Fox Hill. The address precision is delivery point. Absolutely a valid address, verified right down to the delivery point. Okay, so don't get deceived by ambiguous means, oh, well, there's something shady or, there's something not quality about it. It's a real address. Ambiguous just means there was more than one in the output. Okay, as I go to the next slide, we're going to look at the output for 22 Fox Lane. Notice. So with this other candidate, it has its own API output. The verification status is still ambiguous. In this case, the address precision is also delivery point. So these are both perfectly valid addresses. Just happen to be two of them in the response. We just get a couple more examples here. We're getting fairly close to done. So here I've got a Mexican address, Flor 22 in Puebla, Mexico. You see that there's a Cerrada de la Flor 22 and there's a Privada de la Flor 22. Both good matches. And so you see verifications for both of them. You're going to see a verification status of ambiguous, but you want to check the address precision in each case. So in the case of the one on the left, Cerrada de la Flor, we have an address precision of premise. We do recommend treating that as a valid address. Let me go to the next slide, and I'm going to highlight the one on the right, Privada de la Flor. Verification status is ambiguous, but in this case, the address precision is only thoroughfare. So this is an example of, this is a less quality address. We're only able to verify it to the street. We know that Privada de la Flor is a good street, but the 22 part may not exist. We don't have it in our data. Okay, so here we've just been looking at some examples of ambiguous, more than one response. And another example where you may see several examples in the responses. Suppose I input a PO box in a foreign country, like especially in Canada, for example. If I go PO Box 123 in Toronto, Canada, but I don't give a postal code, well, there are bunches of post offices in Toronto. It's a very large place, and so there are going to be several PO Box 123s in Toronto, and you'll see several candidates, each with their own postal code. Right? They're all perfectly good addresses. The verification status on that's going to be ambiguous, and you'll see in those cases you'll see an address precision of delivery point for all of them.
So is it possible that the US version will also deliver two addresses?
Yes. Yeah, the US,
That's not
our
just
US
international.
API also does multiples.
Yeah, we didn't bring that up. It is possible to get based on it. It's actually pretty rare in the US Street API, but there's two times that you might see multiple addresses in the response from the US Street API. Basically, the address, there's two versions of an address that are really, really close to each other. Maybe the only difference is like a directional. The classic example we use is 1 Rosedale Street, Baltimore, Maryland. If you submit that, see there happens to be a 1 North Rosedale and a 1 South Rosedale, and so you'll get both of those in the response. It doesn't happen, honestly, it doesn't happen very often in the US Street API, but that's one example. is if we have a solid match for you, but there's a one north and there's a one south. We'll give them both to you.
So pro tip here, by default, the candidate's value on input for US Street is set to 1. I recommend setting it higher. Set it to 10. 10 is the max. If you leave it at the default, or if you don't set it, then even if there are two matches, if it's ambiguous, we'll only get one back. So I recommend setting it higher, and then on your side, deal with the exceptions. When more than one comes back, decide what you want to do with it. Pick the first one, or display both to your clients, or whatever. So
Sure.
definitely set the candidate's value higher than 1.
This question comes from someone that has a U.S. rooftop geocoding license. They say in the cases where there's more than one candidate match returned, do you have advice on the hierarchy of fields and values to interrogate in order to choose the best match? So in the event that they say, yeah, we're going to look at up to 3 or whatever, how would you pick?
When we return a response, all 3, if there's 3 responses, all 3 are equally good.
Oh, great.
So
Real useful. Jeffrey.
Yeah, there's no better one. What if you give us one Rosedale, Baltimore, Maryland, and we return a rooftop geocode for one north and a parcel geocode or a street level geocode for one south? That just means that our geocode for those 2 addresses, one of them is not as good as it could be, but as far as the match candidate, neither of them is better than the other one. So the only time we return an ambiguous response is if we can't guess definitively which one you meant.
So I guess the answer to the question would be you drive to the house, you drive to the location, you start knocking doors, and you figure out which one's the one you want.
Yeah, essentially it comes down to we don't know which one they want. In the US side, when we present 2 candidates, they're both valid. And we don't know. Honestly, there's no way for us to know which one you want.
Another example is P.O. Box 10, New York, New York. How many P.O. Box 10s are there in the city of New York? We can't know. And so we would return 10 or even 15 P.O. Box 10s. That's an indication that, you really should get back to your client. Don't accept just P.O. Box 10 in New York. Make sure you get a zip code.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yep. All right. I believe, let's see, I'm thinking we're wrapping up here. My summary slide here, we've talked about the US Street API. We've talked about the International Street API. And these are the output fields. If you're wanting to answer the question, is the address real? These are the 2 output fields. For US Street, it's DPV match code and enhanced match. For International Street Address API, verification status, and as precision. I hope that's been clear. It's been great to work with you. One last double check on any questions we need to answer.
We don't have any questions. I do want to let everybody know I posted in the chat links to our US Street API information and our International Street API information. A lot of what we've talked about today is there in that documentation.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
So you don't have to memorize this or pull up this video recording every single time you want to look at the output. It is written down there, but we are happy to help if you need it. You can always, anywhere on our website in the bottom right corner, there's a chat bubble and it goes to Lyle's team. So he's set. One other question. Can you elaborate at all about the relationship between the autocomplete APIs and the street APIs? You can just say no if you want.
Yeah, we can certainly elaborate.
That'd be great.
You want to jump on that one, Jeffrey?
Sure. We recommend using autocomplete first. So in both cases, the API can be used to match an address. Autocomplete is designed to be used in real time as someone is typing in an address. The street API is designed to be used after they've typed in the full address and you submit it. So if you submit a partial address to the street API, it will fail because it doesn't have enough context. Whereas the autocomplete, as you're typing characters, we are returning likely candidates or likely address suggestions for you, likely candidates. So between the two, we definitely recommend using autocomplete first and then US Street after, and that applies to international as well. Use them both. If you only use one, use the street one, but we recommend both.
Yeah, there are definitely different contexts for each. The autocomplete, and again, the difference between autocomplete for US versus international, it's a similar difference, autocomplete versus US versus the street version of the API. The autocomplete is specifically for input of a partial address, and you get back suggestions, several suggestions. In contrast, the US Street API, the International Street API is for input of a complete address, and you get especially in the case of the US Street API, you get metadata back. So if you need to get the +4 code, if you need to get a geocode, latitude, longitude, if you want to find out residential versus commercial, any kind of metadata, that you only get back from the US Street Address API. Hopefully that clarifies the difference between kind of the two tools.
I think it does.
Okay.
It did for me. So that means that was pretty solid. All right. There's no other questions. Thanks everybody for joining our webinar. Thanks Lyle and Jeffrey for your time. Feel free to share this recording as it goes out later today with anybody that you think would need it, or those links that we included in the chat. You can send that out to your developers or whoever is going to be working on this project for you. And we hope that you guys come to more webinars and enjoy your address validation. See you guys.
Thanks.